The mountains of Pinecrest Valley have always kept secrets, some buried under snow, others hidden in the hearts of those who call this place home. But the story I'm about to share with you isn't just about secrets. It's about how life can change. In a single snowfall, how strangers can become family, and how sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones that glitter, but the ones that heal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Morgan's hands weren't always rough. Before grief carved itself into every line and callus, they had been steady, purposeful, creating beauty from raw timber. The workshop behind his modest cabin at Aspen Creek Farm used to sing with the sound of his craft. Now, it stood silent most days, a memorial to the life he once had. 2 winters had passed since Katherine's illness took her, but for Daniel, time moved differently now. Slower, colder. The cabin they'd built together 15 years ago seemed too large and too small all at once. The firewood he split each morning, the coffee he brewed, the quiet that followed him like a shadow. All of it a reminder that he was the only one left to witness his own life unfolding. "You can't keep going like this, Danny," Martha Wilson had told him last week when he finally made his monthly trip into town for supplies. Her general store was the heart of Pinecrest Valley, a place where news traveled faster than the mountain winds. "That workshop of yours was your livelihood." Daniel had simply nodded, avoiding the concern in her eyes as he counted out the last of his money. The truth hung between them, unspoken but understood. His savings were dwindling. The commissions had dried up, not because his skill had faded, but because somewhere between Katherine's diagnosis and her final breath, his desire to create had vanished. "Got another storm coming," Sheriff Jim Hawkins mentioned as he entered the store, stomping snow from his boots. "Weather Service is calling it the worst in a decade. You stocked up enough, Morgan?" "I'll manage," Daniel replied, the way he always did. Jim exchanged a glance with Martha. "Well, might want to hurry back. Supposed to hit hard by nightfall." Daniel nodded again and gathered his meager supplies. He hadn't bothered with the newspaper anymore. What was the point? The world beyond Pinecrest Valley had ceased to matter much. But as he headed toward his truck, the headline on the paper rack caught his eye. "Search continues for missing winter sisters." 3 young faces stared back at him from beneath the bold type. Something about their eyes made him pause, but he shook it off. Someone else's tragedy. The world was full of them. The drive back to Aspen Creek was familiar enough that his mind could wander. Past the Thompson property with its faded red barn, around the curve where the creek bent sharp and dangerous, up the winding road where the pines grew thicker and the world grew quieter. His tires left tracks in the light dusting of early snow, tracks that would soon be erased by what was coming. Daniel's cabin appeared through the trees like a memory. Smoke curled from the chimney. He'd banked the fire before leaving, and for just a moment he could almost imagine Katherine waiting inside, her smile warm as the hearth. But the moment passed, as it always did. He was unloading his supplies when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, the way it sometimes caught between the cabin and the workshop, creating a sound almost like a human voice. But then it came again, clearer, desperate. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, we need help." Daniel dropped the bag of flour he was carrying and turned toward the sound. Coming up the long drive to his cabin was a sight that didn't belong in this remote stretch of mountain. 3 figures huddled together against the intensifying snow, the tallest one waving frantically. "Please," the voice called again. "Our car went off the road." Something dormant in Daniel stirred to life. He moved without thinking, covering the distance between them in long strides. As he got closer, he realized they were just girls, young ones at that. The oldest couldn't be more than 17, her arm protectively around the smallest, who looked no more than 8 or 9. "What are you doing all the way out here?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. The oldest girl's face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. "Our GPS, it took us on this back road. Then the snow got worse, and we slid into a ditch about 2 miles back." She gestured vaguely behind them. "We saw your chimney smoke through the trees." The middle girl, her hair falling in damp ringlets around her face, added, "We tried calling for help, but there's no cell service." Daniel looked at them more closely. Their clothes weren't meant for mountain weather. Light jackets, worn sneakers. The smallest one was trembling visibly, her small hand clutching a worn backpack like it contained all that mattered in the world. "You're freezing," he stated simply, then glanced at the sky. The clouds hung low and threatening, the first heavy flakes beginning to fall. The storm was coming earlier than predicted. "Come on, inside." He turned toward the cabin without waiting for a response. What choice did they have? What choice did he have? You couldn't leave children to the mercy of a Colorado mountain blizzard, no matter how much you preferred your solitude. The girls followed him, their footsteps crunching in the snow behind him. At the door he paused, his hand on the knob. It had been a long time since anyone besides himself had entered this space. The thought made something twist in his chest. Discomfort, maybe, or guilt. "It's not much," he said as he pushed the door open, "but it's warm." The cabin was exactly what it needed to be, functional, sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden floor. A kitchen area with basic appliances, a small dining table with 4 chairs, though only one showed signs of use. Bookshelves lined another. Wall filled with volumes on woodworking, local history, and the few novels Katherine had loved. The girls hesitated at the threshold, and Daniel realized how this must look. A stranger's home in the middle of nowhere, a man they didn't know. "I'm Daniel Morgan," he offered, moving to stoke the fire. "This is Aspen Creek Farm, though there's not much farming happening these days." The oldest girl straightened her shoulders, something proud in her bearing despite her bedraggled appearance. "I'm Eleanor Winters. These are my sisters, Charlotte and Grace." She nodded to each in turn. "Thank you for helping us, Mr. Morgan." There was something formal in her manner that struck Daniel as unusual for someone so young. The way she stood, the careful way she spoke, like someone who had been taught the importance of first impressions. "Call me Daniel," he said, then gestured to the fire. "Get warmed up, I'll make some hot chocolate." The youngest, Grace, looked up at this, the first hint of childish excitement breaking through her fearful expression. "With marshmallows?" she asked hopefully. Daniel paused, something catching in his throat. Katherine had always insisted on keeping marshmallows in the pantry, even though he never used them in his coffee. "Probably have some," he managed to say. As he moved to the kitchen, he heard the girls whispering among themselves, their voices too low to make out the words. He put the kettle on and rummaged through the cabinets, finding the tin of cocoa and, yes, a bag of marshmallows, slightly stale but serviceable. "When do you think we can get back to our car?" Charlotte, the middle sister, asked as he returned with 4 steaming mugs. Daniel shook his head, nodding toward the window where snow was now falling in earnest, thick flakes, swirling in the wind. "Not today. Probably not tomorrow either from the look of it. They're calling this the century storm." Eleanor's expression tightened. "But we need to—" She stopped herself, exchanging a glance with Charlotte. "Need to what?" Daniel asked, handing out the mugs of cocoa. "Nothing," Eleanor said quickly. "Just our things are in the car." Daniel studied her face, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. But he didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, their reasons. He knew that better than most. "I can try to reach the sheriff on my radio once the storm lets up a bit," he offered. "Let him know where your car is, But for now, you're stuck here. I've got a spare room with a bed, and the couch pulls out. It's not fancy, but it'll do." Grace, who had been blowing carefully on her hot chocolate, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are you all alone here, Mr. Daniel?" The innocence of the question landed like a physical blow. Daniel cleared his throat. "Yes, just me now." "Where's your family?" she persisted, earning a warning look from Eleanor. "Grace, that's not polite," the oldest sister admonished. Daniel waved it off. "It's fine. My wife, Katherine, she passed away 2 years ago. No children. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of shared understanding. These girls knew something about loss. He could see it in their eyes. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. Daniel nodded once, accepting the condolence with the same quiet resignation he had accepted all the others. "Let me show you where you can rest. You must be tired after walking so far in this weather." As he led them to the spare room, he noticed how they stayed close together, the oldest keeping the youngest between them, like they were protecting her. Their backpacks, one each and not very full, were clutched tightly in their hands. "Bathrooms down the hall," he explained, pointing. "There should be clean towels in the cabinet if you want to warm up with a shower. I'll see what I can find for you to change into. Might have some old shirts that could work as nightgowns at least." Eleanor nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Daniel, we don't want to impose, but—" "You're not imposing if I'm offering." He cut her off, more gruffly than he intended, then softer. "It's no trouble." As he turned to leave them to get settled, Grace spoke up again. "Mr. Daniel, are there monsters in these mountains?" Daniel paused, looking back at the small girl with her solemn eyes. "No real ones," he answered carefully. "Just the weather, and that's dangerous enough, but you're safe here." Grace seemed to consider this, then nodded, apparently satisfied. Back in the main room, Daniel stood by the window, watching the snow transform his property into something otherworldly. Already the path the girls had taken was disappearing under fresh powder. His truck was becoming a white mound in the driveway. The workshop, a dark shadow beyond, seemed to be fading into the white void. 3 young girls, stranded. With him, of all people. A man who could barely remember to speak aloud most days, whose idea of company was the memory of his wife, and the occasional visit from Martha or Jim when they grew too concerned about his isolation. Daniel ran a hand through his graying hair. Katherine would have known what to do, how to make them feel welcome. She had always been the one with the natural warmth, the easy smile. All he had was a cabin, some hot chocolate, and the promise of a storm that would likely keep them all trapped for days. The sound of the shower running filtered through the cabin walls. Daniel moved to his and Katherine's bedroom, his bedroom now, and opened the dresser, pulling out a few of his smaller flannel shirts and a pair of sweatpants that might work for Eleanor with the drawstring pulled tight. From a box at the back of the closet, he retrieved a folded stack of clothes he hadn't been able to part with, Katherine's things, a nightshirt that might fit Charlotte, a t-shirt that would swamp little Grace but was better than nothing. He placed the clothes outside the bathroom door and returned to the kitchen, taking stock of his supplies. He'd just been to town, so he had the basics: flour, coffee, beans, some canned goods. Enough for one person for a couple of weeks. With 4 mouths to feed, and growing girls at that, it would go faster. But they'd manage. They'd have to. As he was making a mental inventory, he heard the bathroom door open, followed by soft footsteps. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair damp, her small frame swimming in his flannel shirt. "The others are getting cleaned up," she said. "Thank you for the clothes." Daniel nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Hungry?" She hesitated, then admitted, "Starving, actually. We haven't eaten since breakfast." "I'll start dinner," he said, reaching for a cast-iron pan. "Nothing fancy, just eggs and biscuits. That work?" A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. That sounds wonderful, actually. As Daniel cracked eggs into a bowl, Eleanor hovered nearby, clearly wanting to help, but unsure if she should offer. After a moment, she spoke again. "I should explain about us," she began, her voice careful, measured. "About why we're out here." Daniel glanced at her, then back to his task. "You don't owe me explanations." "Maybe not," she agreed, "but I think you deserve one anyway." Before she could continue, Charlotte and Grace appeared, both similarly dressed in the borrowed clothes, Grace practically swimming in Katherine's old t-shirt. "Something smells good," Charlotte said, her tone deliberately light. Daniel nodded toward the table. "Have a seat. Food's almost ready." As they gathered around the table, all 4 chairs in use for the first time in years, Daniel was struck by how strange and yet familiar it felt to have others in this space. The silence that typically accompanied his meals was replaced by the scrape of forks, the careful thank yous, the occasional question from Grace. "Do you make things?" the youngest sister asked suddenly, pointing toward a small wooden horse that sat on the windowsill, one of the few finished pieces Daniel had kept in the cabin. "Used to," Daniel replied. "I'm a woodworker, or was." "It's beautiful," she said with the pure appreciation only children can offer. Daniel felt his face warm slightly. "Thanks. That was one of the first things I made for my wife." "You don't make things anymore?" Charlotte asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not much. Have a workshop out back, but..." He trailed off, unsure how. To explain to children that sometimes when you lose someone, you also lose pieces of yourself. Eleanor, sensing his discomfort, redirected. "The storm is really picking up," she observed, nodding toward the window where the snow was now falling so heavily that the world beyond the glass had all but disappeared. "Forecast said it could last 3 days," Daniel confirmed. "We'll be all right here. Got a generator if the power goes, plenty of firewood." 3 days, Charlotte repeated, looking anxiously at Eleanor. Something passed between the sisters, a silent communication that spoke of shared concerns. "Is there someone waiting for you?" Daniel asked. "Someone who'll be worried?" Eleanor's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "No," she said after a moment. "There's no one waiting, not anymore." The simple statement held volumes, and Daniel understood with sudden clarity what the newspaper headline had meant. These weren't just girls who had taken a wrong turn. They were the Winter sisters from the paper, the ones being searched for. "Your parents?" he asked quietly. Eleanor set down her fork. "Our father died 5 years ago. Our mother. She passed away 3 weeks ago. Sudden heart attack." Grace's small face crumpled slightly at the mention, and Charlotte reached over to squeeze her hand. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, and meant it. Eleanor straightened in her chair, her chin lifting slightly. "We were supposed to go into foster care, separately. Different homes." Her voice hardened. "We promised our mother we'd stay together, no matter what." "So you ran," Daniel concluded. She met his gaze steadily. "We had no choice." Daniel looked at each of them in turn. Eleanor, with her determined eyes, Charlotte with her protective posture, little Grace trying so hard to be brave. He thought of the authorities who must be searching for them, of the rules and systems that would separate 3 sisters who had already lost everything else. And he thought of the storm raging outside, a natural barrier between these girls and whatever future was hunting them down. "Eat your dinner," he said finally. "We'll figure things out once the weather clears." The relief in Eleanor's face was palpable. It wasn't a promise to help them escape, but it wasn't a threat to turn them in either. For tonight, at least, they were safe. Later, as Daniel prepared the spare room and couch for sleeping, he heard the sisters whispering again. This time, he caught fragments. "Tell him and not yet, and need to trust. Their secrets, whatever they were, went deeper than running from foster care. But that was their business, not his. As the girls settled in for the night, Daniel returned to the main room, adding another log to the fire. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, driving snow against the glass in furious gusts. The radio crackled with weather updates, road closures, power outages in town, warnings to stay indoors. Daniel sat in his chair by the fire, listening to the storm and the occasional creak of floorboards as one of the girls shifted in their sleep. The quiet routine of his grief had been disrupted, his solitude invaded by 3 young lives carrying their own burdens. He should feel resentful, he thought, inconvenienced at the very least. Yet instead, he felt something else stirring beneath. The surface, something he hadn't felt in a long time, purpose maybe, or simply the recognition that his pain wasn't the only pain in the world. His gaze fell on the wooden horse that Grace had admired. Katherine had loved it, simple as it was. "It has soul," she'd said. Everything he made back then had soul because he'd made it with love. When was the last time he'd held a carving knife? When was the last time he'd felt the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from raw material? Daniel stood and moved to the window, trying to make out the shape of his workshop through the veil of white. Tomorrow, maybe, he would show the girls. See if there was any wood dry enough to work with. Keep their minds occupied while they waited out the storm. Tomorrow, he decided, would be soon enough to worry about what came next. For tonight, they were all sheltered from the cold. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The morning arrived. With an eerie silence, the kind that only comes when snow has blanketed the world so completely that even the wind holds its breath. Daniel woke at his usual hour, force of habit pulling him from sleep before the sun had fully risen. For a moment, he lay still in his bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of others moving quietly through his home. Soft whispers, a muffled laugh quickly hushed, the subtle creak of floorboards beneath careful feet. It had been so long since the cabin had held voices besides his own that the sound seemed to sink into the wooden walls, warming them somehow. Daniel dressed quickly, pulling on worn jeans and a heavy sweater against the chill. When he emerged from his room, he found Eleanor in the kitchen, her hair twisted into a neat braid, attempting to navigate his coffee maker. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. She turned, a hint of color touching her cheeks. "I hope you don't mind. I thought I'd try to have coffee ready, but your machine is different from what I'm used to." Daniel moved past her, reaching for the coffee canister. "Takes a bit of coaxing," he explained, demonstrating the particular way the lid needed to be aligned. As the machine gurgled to life, he glanced toward the living room where Charlotte was folding the blankets on the pull-out couch. No sign of Grace. "She's still asleep," Eleanor said, following his gaze. "She always sleeps late when she can, says her dreams need extra time." Something about the way she spoke of her youngest sister, with a blend of affection and protective concern, reminded Daniel of the way Katherine had sometimes spoken about the children they'd hoped to have. The comparison came unbidden, and he pushed it away, focusing instead on practical matters. "Hungry?" he asked, moving toward the refrigerator. "I can help," Eleanor offered immediately. "I'm pretty good with eggs if you have any." Daniel pulled out the carton, along with some slightly wilted vegetables and a block of cheese. "Have at it," he said, stepping back to give her room. Something told him this girl was used to taking charge, to caring for others. Letting her cook was the smallest concession he could offer to her obvious need for control in a situation where she had precious little. As Eleanor began cracking eggs into a bowl, Daniel moved to the window. The sight beyond the glass stole his breath. Snow had transformed his property into something from another world. His truck was completely buried, just the edge of a side mirror visible above a pristine drift. The path to the workshop was indistinguishable from the rest of the yard, and still the snow fell, not in the violent gusts of the night before, but in a steady, relentless curtain. "It's beautiful," Charlotte said quietly, having come to stand beside him. In the morning light, he could see her more clearly. The dusting of freckles across her nose, the way her hair curled wildly despite the braid trying to contain it. She was perhaps 14, caught in that liminal space between child and young woman. "And dangerous," Daniel added. "We're not going anywhere for a while." Charlotte's expression clouded. "Our car—" "Buried, most likely," Daniel confirmed. "And the road down to town will be impassable until the plows come through. Could be days." He expected disappointment, perhaps even panic, but Charlotte surprised him. "Well, then we'll just have to make the best of it, won't we?" She turned toward the kitchen. "Ellie makes amazing omelets. You're in for a treat." Daniel watched her join her sister at the stove, the two of them moving in the synchronized way of people who have shared a kitchen countless times. They fit together, these sisters, each seeming to know the other's thoughts without words. It made his solitary existence feel suddenly stark in comparison. "I'll check the generator," he said, more to himself than to them. "Make sure we're set if the power goes." He pulled on his heavy coat and boots and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit him immediately, stealing his breath. But it was the stillness that struck him most. The silence of a world transformed. His breath clouded before him as he trudged through knee-deep snow toward the shed, where the generator hummed steadily. Everything looked different under the blanket of white. Distances altered, familiar landmarks obscured. Even the workshop, a building he could find blindfolded, seemed somehow changed, its dark wood stark against the brilliance of the snow. Daniel checked the generator's fuel level, still 3/4 full, and secured the shed door against the continuing snowfall. As he turned back toward the cabin, he noticed fresh tracks leading toward the workshop, small boot prints partially filled with new snow. Frowning, he followed them, concern growing with each step. The workshop had been closed up for over a year, the tools inside gathering dust. It wasn't a place for children to wander. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness between white-edged wood. Daniel pushed it open, wincing at the protesting creak of hinges gone too long without oil. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. For a long moment, silence answered him. Then, from the far corner where shadows gathered thickest, came a small voice. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to go where I wasn't allowed." Grace sat perched on an old stool, her small frame bundled in one of Katherine's old sweaters that Eleanor must have found, her feet dangling well above the floor. In her hands, she held a small piece of cherry wood, one of dozens that lay scattered across the workbench beside her. "Does this place make you sad?" she asked, her eyes wide and solemn in the dim light filtering through snow-covered windows. Daniel moved closer, the familiar sense of sawdust and linseed oil wrapping around him like old friends long forgotten. "Why do you ask that?" Grace glanced around the workshop, taking in the half-finished projects, the tools hanging precisely on their hooks, the fine layer of dust covering everything. "Because it feels like you loved it here, but then you stopped coming." Her simple observation landed with unexpected weight. Daniel looked around the space, really looked for the first time in months. The rocking chair he'd been making for Katherine when she first got sick, its back rails shaped but unsanded. The set of nesting bowls he'd promised the church for, their spring fundraiser, now well past due. The blocks of maple and walnut he'd been saving for something special. "You're not wrong," he admitted finally. Grace nodded, as if his answer confirmed something important. "My mum had a garden," she said, turning the piece of cherry wood over in her small hands. After my dad died, she wouldn't go in it anymore. Said it hurt too much to see the flowers they planted together. Her brow furrowed with the weight of remembering. But then last year, she started again. Said sometimes we have to do the things that hurt so we can remember how to find the joy again. Daniel felt something in his chest twist painfully. Out of the mouths of babes, his own mother would have said. He cleared his throat, finding it suddenly tight. That's pretty wise for someone your age, he said. Grace shrugged, the gesture pure childish nonchalance. I'm 9. That's not so little. Despite himself, Daniel felt his lips curve upward. Not, and quite a smile, but the closest thing to one he'd managed in a long while. No, I suppose it's not. He glanced again at the piece of wood in her hands. That's cherry, he said. One of my favorites to work with. Hard enough to last, but soft. Enough to take detail well. Grace's eyes lit with interest. Could you show me how to make something with it? The question hung between them, innocent but loaded with implications. To show her would mean picking up his tools again, re-engaging with the craft that had once defined him. It would mean stepping back into a part of himself he'd left behind with Katherine. Before he could answer, a voice called from outside. Grace, Mr. Morgan. In here, Daniel called back, turning toward the door as Eleanor appeared, snowflakes clinging to her hair and eyelashes. There you are, she said, relief evident in her voice as she spotted her youngest sister. Breakfast is ready, and I was worried when I couldn't find either of you. Her gaze swept the workshop, taking in the tools, the wood, the evidence of Daniel's former passion. I'm sorry if Grace was bothering you. She wasn't, Daniel assured her. He hesitated, then added, she was asking if I might show her how to make something. Eleanor's expression softened. She's always been fascinated by how things are made. Too curious for her own good sometimes. Curiosity is good in a woodworker, Daniel found himself saying. Helps you see what's hiding in the wood, waiting to come out. Grace hopped down from the stool, still clutching the piece of cherry. Can I keep this? She asked. Just to hold? Daniel nodded. Sure. As they made their way back to the cabin, trudging through the deepening snow, Daniel found himself thinking about the workshop in a way he hadn't allowed himself to for months. The half-finished projects, the tools waiting to be used, the wood waiting to tell its stories. Maybe the child was right. Maybe sometimes you had to do the things that hurt to remember how to find joy again. Inside, the cabin was transformed by morning light and the smell of cooking. Charlotte had set the table, using the mismatched plates Daniel rarely bothered with anymore. Steam rose from a platter of golden omelets, and a pot of coffee sat ready beside 4 mugs. I hope you don't mind, Charlotte said, gesturing to the table. We found some preserves in your pantry. Strawberry, I think? Daniel recognized the jar, one of the last Katherine had made the summer before she got sick. He'd been rationing them, unable to bear the thought of opening the final jar and losing that last tangible piece of her. But seeing it now on the table, waiting to be shared, he found he didn't mind as much as he'd expected. That's fine, he said, hanging his coat by the door. Katherine, my wife, she made those. The 3 sisters exchanged a glance. Something unspoken passing between them. We don't have to open it, Eleanor said quickly. Daniel shook his head. No, it's good. She'd have wanted them to be enjoyed. They settled around the table, the strange new routine already beginning to feel less awkward than it had the night before. The omelets were indeed good, fluffy, filled, with vegetables and cheese, clearly made by someone who knew their way around a kitchen. This is excellent, Daniel said after his first bite. Eleanor's cheeks colored slightly at the praise. Our mother taught us all to cook, said it was an essential life skill. She sounds like a smart woman, Daniel observed. She was, Charlotte said, her voice wavering slightly. She spoke 5 languages and could name every constellation in the sky, Grace added, and she told the best bedtime stories about princesses and kingdoms and adventures. Daniel noticed the way Eleanor tensed at this, throwing a quick glance at her youngest sister that clearly said, "Be careful." Another reminder that these girls carried secrets they weren't ready to share. "What about your mother?" Charlotte asked, clearly trying to redirect the conversation. "Was she a good cook too?" Daniel found himself answering before he could consider whether he wanted to. She was. Taught Katherine, actually. They used to spend whole weekends canning together when the garden was producing more than we could eat. "You had a garden?" Grace asked, perking up. "Still do, though it's gone wild the past couple years." Daniel gestured vaguely toward the rear of the property where, under the snow, the raised beds Katherine had lovingly tended now lay dormant and overgrown. Katherine could grow anything, had a way with plants. "Our mother too," Eleanor said, softly. "She always said growing things was an act of hope." The simple statement hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than its few words would suggest. An act of hope. Wasn't that what all creation was in the end? Whether coaxing plants from soil or shapes from wood, it was all an affirmation that tomorrow would come, that beauty still mattered. After breakfast, the question of how to spend the day loomed large. The storm showed no signs of abating, the snow continuing to fall in a steady curtain that limited visibility to just a few yards beyond the windows. The radio reported that the main road into Pinecrest Valley was completely closed, power was out in sections of town, and residents were advised to stay indoors. "Well," Daniel said finally, surveying the 3 expectant faces, "we could light the fireplace in the living room. There are some books, a few board games Katherine kept for when friends visited. Or," Grace said, clutching her piece of cherry wood, "you could show us your workshop. Really show us, I mean." Daniel hesitated, feeling the familiar resistance rise within him, but something about the eager light in the child's eyes made the no die in his throat. "Grace," Eleanor began, clearly sensing his discomfort, "I'm sure Mr. Morgan has other things he needs to do." "Actually," Daniel heard himself say, "that's not a bad idea. The workshop has a wood stove. If we get that going, it'll be plenty warm. Could give us something to do while we wait out the storm." The surprise on Eleanor's face mirrored his own internal reaction. When was the last time he'd voluntarily suggested entering his workshop, let alone sharing it with others? "Are you sure?" she asked. "We don't want to impose." Daniel shrugged. Not much else to do, and it might be good to clear some of the dust out of there. And so, after bundling up in whatever warm layers they could find, Daniel lending the girls extra socks and gloves, they made their way through the snow to the workshop. Daniel went ahead, struggling to forge a path through drifts that now reached mid-thigh in places. By the time they reached the workshop door, they were all breathless, their cheeks ruddy with cold and exertion. Inside, Daniel set about lighting. The wood stove, his movements automatic despite the months of disuse. As warmth began to spread through the space, the girls explored, moving carefully around workbenches and tools with curious, respectful eyes. "What's this?" Charlotte asked, pointing to a jig set up on one of the benches. "Dovetail guide," Daniel explained, running his fingers along the familiar contours. "Helps make joints for drawers and boxes." "And this?" Eleanor inquired, gesturing toward a wall of chisels arranged by size. "Different chisels for different tasks," Daniel said, finding himself warming to the subject. "That set there is for detail work, carving faces, flowers, that sort of thing." Grace wandered to the half-finished rocking chair, her small hand touching one of the back rails. "Were you making this for someone special?" Daniel felt the familiar pang at the sight of the chair, Katherine's chair, but pushed through it. "For my wife. She always wanted a rocking chair for the front porch, to watch the sunsets. The sisters exchanged glances again, that silent communication Daniel was beginning to recognize. "Could we help you finish it?" Charlotte asked tentatively. Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the offer. "It's not that simple. Woodworking takes practice, skill." "We're quick learners," Eleanor said, a hint of pride in her voice. "And it seems wrong for something so beautiful to remain unfinished." Daniel looked at the chair again, seeing it through. Fresh eyes, the curves of the armrests he'd shaped to fit Katherine's arms perfectly. The spindles he'd turned with such care, the beginnings of the flower pattern he'd planned to carve into the headrest. Lilies, her favorite. "Maybe," he said finally. "We could start with something simpler, though. See how that goes." The relief and excitement that crossed the girls' faces made something shift in Daniel's chest, a loosening of the bands that had held his grief so tightly bound for so long. He moved to a cabinet and pulled out several blocks of pine, soft, forgiving wood that would be gentle on beginners' hands. "We'll start with the basics, how to read the grain, how to use a plane, how to sand properly." For the next hours, the workshop filled with the sounds that had been absent for too long. The scrape of a plane over wood, the tap of a mallet, laughter when something went wrong. Daniel found himself explaining techniques he hadn't thought about consciously in years, muscle memory guiding his hands as he demonstrated for 3 pairs of attentive eyes. Eleanor approached woodworking with the same focused determination she seemed to bring to everything. Methodical, careful, her brow furrowed in concentration. Charlotte was more intuitive, feeling her way through the process, her natural creativity, leading her to see possibilities Daniel hadn't considered. And Grace, for all her youth, showed a surprising patience, her small hands steady as she carefully sanded the piece of cherry wood she'd claimed, transforming it slowly from a rough block to something smooth and gleaming. By mid-afternoon, the wood stove had made the workshop almost cozy. Daniel had pulled out some of Katherine's old quilts from a chest. She'd always complained the workshop was too cold, and the girls had spread them across benches and stools, creating impromptu sitting areas. Grace had fallen asleep on one such nest, her piece of cherry wood still clutched in her hand, her face peaceful in a way that made her look even younger than her 9 years. "She hasn't slept that soundly in weeks," Eleanor said softly, watching her youngest sister. "Not since our mother," she trailed off, the pain still too fresh for words. Daniel nodded in understanding. "Grief takes a long time," he said, his voice low to avoid waking Grace. "And it's different for everyone." Eleanor looked at him then, really looked, her eyes searching his face. "Does it ever go away, the hole they leave behind?" It was the question everyone wanted to ask, but few dared to. Daniel considered his answer carefully, aware that this girl had lost both parents by the age of 17, that she now carried the burden of her sister's well-being on her young shoulders. "No," he said honestly, "but it changes, becomes something you carry with you instead of something that carries you. At least, that's what I'm told." "You're not there yet," she observed, not a question. Daniel's gaze drifted to the unfinished rocking chair. "No, not yet." Charlotte, who had been quietly working on a small carving nearby, looked up. "Our mother used to say that grief is just love with nowhere to go." The simple wisdom of it caught Daniel by surprise. "That's actually a good way to put it. She also said," Charlotte continued, her fingers still working the wood, "that eventually you find new places to put that love. It doesn't replace what was lost, but it gives the heart something to do besides hurt." Daniel considered this as he watched Charlotte's hands shaping the wood, confident despite her inexperience, guiding the knife with intuition rather than technique. Her small carving was beginning to take shape, a bird, he thought, or perhaps a flower. something growing from the raw material, guided by her vision. "Your mother sounds like she was very wise," he said. "She was," Eleanor agreed, her voice soft with memory. "But she also made mistakes, big ones sometimes." Something in her tone made Daniel glance up sharply. There was more there, something unspoken but heavy with significance. "Everyone makes mistakes," he offered. Eleanor met his gaze, something fierce and protective in her eyes. "Yes, but not everyone's mistakes force their children to run away from everything they've ever known." The statement hung between them, Eleanor clearly having said more than she intended. She looked away quickly, focusing on the wood in her hands with renewed intensity. Daniel didn't press. Whatever secrets these girls carried, they would share. Them in their own time, if at all. He had no right to demand their trust. After all, he was still a stranger, a temporary shelter against the storm. Instead, he stood and moved to check the wood stove, adding another log to the glowing embers. "Getting late," he observed, noticing how the light through the snow-covered windows had begun to fade. "We should head back to the cabin soon. Start thinking about dinner." Charlotte nodded, setting aside her carving. "I can help with that. I make a mean vegetable stew if you have the ingredients." "Should have basics," Daniel replied, mentally cataloguing his pantry. "Might not be fancy, but it'll be hot." "We don't need fancy," Eleanor said, rising to gently wake Grace. "Just enough." As they prepared to brave the snow again, gathering their projects and extinguishing the wood stove, Daniel found himself watching the three sisters, the way they moved in concert, each anticipating the other's needs. Eleanor helping Grace into her borrowed coat, Charlotte gathering their wooden creations, carefully wrapping them in a scrap of cloth. Grace, still sleepy, leaning against Eleanor's side, with complete trust. They were a family, these three, bound not just by blood, but by shared loss, shared struggle, shared determination to stay together, despite whatever forces sought to separate them. In their quiet resilience, Daniel recognized something of himself and Katherine, the way they had faced every challenge side by side, the deep certainty that together they could weather any storm, until the storm that took her away. The cabin welcomed them back with its solid warmth, the generator humming steadily despite the worsening weather outside. After stomping snow from their boots and hanging damp coats to dry, they settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Charlotte and Daniel in the kitchen preparing dinner, Eleanor helping Grace wash up after their day in the workshop. "You're good with tools," Daniel observed, as Charlotte expertly chopped carrots for the stew. "Ever done any woodworking before today?" She shook her head. "No, but I've always been good with my hands. Mom used to say I had an artist's soul." A faint smile touched her lips. "I used to draw all the time before—" When she didn't continue, Daniel prompted gently. "Before?" Charlotte's knife hesitated over the cutting board. "Before things got complicated," she said finally. "When we had to start being more careful about everything." Another piece of the puzzle, though Daniel still couldn't see the full picture. Being careful suggested they were hiding from something or someone. The secrets these girls carried seemed to grow more complex with each passing hour. "Well," he said, choosing not to pursue the matter, "you've got a natural talent. The bird you were carving, it's good, real good." Charlotte's face brightened. "You could tell it was a bird? I wasn't sure it looked right." "Eastern bluebird," Daniel said. "Katherine used to put out feeders for them. I'd know that shape anywhere." The smile that spread across Charlotte's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds, radiant, transformative. For a moment, Daniel could see the carefree child she might have been before grief and secrets had shadowed her young life. "Maybe tomorrow you could show me how to make it better?" she asked, a tentative hope in her voice. Daniel found himself nodding. "Sure. Got some proper carving tools that would make it easier." The simple exchange, an offer, an acceptance, a promise of tomorrow, felt significant somehow. A small bridge extended between his isolated existence and these unexpected visitors. Dinner was a simple affair, but more satisfying than anything Daniel had eaten in months. Charlotte's stew, made from whatever they'd found in his pantry, filled the cabin with savory aromas that seemed to chase away some of the lingering shadows. They ate at the table again, all 4 chairs occupied, the conversation flowing more easily than it had the night before. Grace regaled them with a detailed description of a dream she'd had during her nap, something about flying horses and castles in the clouds. Charlotte shared some of her drawings, sketched in the margins of a notebook she'd been carrying. Eleanor spoke of books she'd loved growing up, her face animated in a way Daniel hadn't seen before, and Daniel found himself talking too about the first piece of furniture he'd ever made, a wobbly nightstand for his mother, about the year he and Katherine had spent renovating the cabin, about the family of bears that sometimes wandered through the property in the spring. It wasn't until they were clearing the dishes that Daniel realized he'd spoken more in one evening than he had in the past month. The realization brought a strange mix of emotions. Guilt, as if he were somehow betraying Katherine's memory by finding comfort in new company, but also a tentative sense of relief, like a muscle long clenched, finally beginning to relax. As night settled fully over the mountains, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind had picked up again, howling around the corners of the cabin with renewed ferocity. The radio reported that the main roads remained impassable, and power outages had spread to nearly half the county. "Looks like we're in for another day at least," Daniel said, returning from checking the generator one last time before bed. "Maybe 2. Eleanor nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you again for letting us stay. I know this isn't what you signed up for." "Neither. Did you?" Daniel pointed out. "Getting stranded in a blizzard with a stranger." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "No, but there are worse places to be stranded, worse people to be stranded with." The simple statement, delivered without flourish, caught Daniel off guard. It occurred to him that in their short time together, he'd come to respect this young woman, her strength, her determination to protect her sisters, her ability to adapt to circumstances beyond her control. "Well," he said, uncomfortable with the implied compliment, "we'll see if you still feel that way after another couple days of my cooking." This drew a genuine laugh from Eleanor, a bright, unexpected sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. As they prepared for bed, the routine now more familiar than it had been the night before, Daniel found himself pausing by the windowsill where the wooden horse still stood. He picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. The smooth curves worn by years of handling. Katherine had kept it on her bedside table until the day she died. "That's beautiful," Eleanor said softly, appearing beside him. "You made it?" Daniel nodded. "Long time ago. One of the first things I carved." "It's full of love," she observed. "You can see it in every detail." Daniel looked at her, struck by the perception. "That's what Katherine always said, that everything I made had a piece of my heart in it." She was right. Eleanor's gaze moved past him to the snow-covered world beyond the window. "Do you think the storm will really last another day?" "At least," Daniel confirmed. "These mountain blizzards are nothing to take lightly. Even after the snow stops, it'll take time for the roads to clear." Eleanor nodded, her brow furrowing slightly. "I should check our supplies," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Make sure we have enough until—" When she didn't finish the thought, Daniel prompted, "Until what?" She met his gaze steadily. "Until we figure out our next move." The honesty in her voice was refreshing. No pretense that this was a simple mishap, a brief detour before returning to normal life, whatever normal might mean for 3 orphaned sisters on the run. No rush to figure that out, Daniel found himself saying. "You're safe here for now, that's what matters." The relief that crossed Eleanor's face made him realize how much weight she carried on her young shoulders, the constant vigilance, the worry for her sisters, the burden of decisions no 17-year-old should have to make alone. "Thank you," she said simply, and he understood she was thanking him for more than just shelter. Later, as Daniel lay in his bed listening to the storm rage outside, he found his thoughts turning toward the workshop again. The unfinished projects waiting there, the tools gathering dust, the half-completed rocking chair that had been Katherine's last request. Maybe it was time, not to forget, never that, but to honor her memory by finishing what he'd started, by finding his way back to the craft that had once given him such purpose. And maybe, just maybe, these 3 unexpected visitors were part of that journey, crossing his path at exactly the moment he needed to be reminded that life continued even after loss. That creation was, as Eleanor's mother had said, an act of hope. With that thought, Daniel drifted into the first truly restful sleep he'd had in months, as outside his window, the century storm wrapped the world in white, isolating Aspen Creek Farm from everything but the present moment and the 4 souls it now sheltered. By the 3rd day of the storm, a strange new rhythm had settled over Aspen Creek Farm. The blizzard continued its assault, though the furious winds had calmed to a steady whisper, the snow falling in fat, lazy flakes that accumulated with deceptive speed. Inside the cabin, surrounded by solid walls and the warmth of the fireplace, it was easy to forget that the outside world existed at all. Daniel woke earlier than usual, the grey pre-dawn light barely filtering through his frost-edged window. For the first time in months, he felt a quiet anticipation for the day ahead. There were projects waiting in the workshop, not just his old abandoned ones, but new beginnings taking shape under 3 pairs of hands that approached the craft. With fresh eyes and untarnished enthusiasm, he moved quietly through the cabin, not wanting to wake the sisters. Grace had taken to sleeping late, making up for what Eleanor had alluded to as months of fitful rest. The youngest sister seemed to be shedding layers of tension with each passing day at Aspen Creek, her nightmares giving way to the deep, healing sleep that children are meant to have. Daniel put coffee on to brew and stood by the kitchen window, watching the dawn slowly illuminate the transformed landscape. His property had disappeared beneath a sea of white, smooth and unbroken, save for the path they'd trampled between cabin and workshop. Even that was filling in again, nature reclaiming what human intervention had briefly disrupted. "It's like we're on an island," said a quiet voice behind him. Daniel turned to find Charlotte standing in the doorway, her wild hair even more untamed from sleep, Katherine's borrowed nightshirt hanging below her knees. She had a sketchbook clutched in one hand, an old one of Katherine's that Daniel had unearthed from a drawer the night before, along with a set of pencils he'd forgotten he had. "In a way we are," he agreed, pouring coffee into a mug and offering it to her. She accepted with a grateful nod. "At least until the road's clear." Charlotte moved to stand beside him at the window, blowing gently on the steaming coffee. "I was drawing this," she said, opening the sketchbook to reveal a detailed rendering of the view outside. The endless white, the dark shapes of trees laden with snow, the workshop half buried in drifts. But she'd added something too, a faint path leading away into the distance, disappearing into the vanishing point of the drawing. "It's good," Daniel said, genuinely impressed. "You've got a real eye." Charlotte shrugged, though he could tell the praise pleased her. "I've always liked to draw what I see, but also what might be. The path, I mean." "The way out," Daniel observed. She glanced up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Or the way forward. Depends on how you look at it." There was wisdom in that, the kind that comes from experiencing more of life's hardships than a 14-year-old should. Daniel nodded slowly. Perspective matters. They stood in companionable silence, sipping coffee and watching the day gradually brighten. The creaking of floorboards announced Eleanor's approach before she appeared, already fully dressed and alert despite the early hour. "Morning," she said, her gaze taking in the quiet scene by the window. "Everything okay?" "Fine," Daniel assured her, "just watching the day arrive." Eleanor nodded, accepting this, though Daniel had noticed she maintained a constant vigilance, always checking, always assessing. The weight of responsibility she carried was evident in the slight tension that never fully left her shoulders, in the way her eyes instinctively sought her sister's whenever she entered a room. The radio said the plows might make it through. "To the county roads by tomorrow," she mentioned, pouring herself coffee, "if the snow lets up today." Daniel nodded. He'd heard the same report the night before. "Still be a while before they reach this far out, though. We're not exactly a priority." He didn't miss the flash of relief that crossed Eleanor's face, quickly hidden behind her mug. Despite her occasional comments about next steps and moving on, it was clear that for now at least, Aspen Creek Farm represented safety. A temporary reprieve from whatever had sent three sisters fleeing into a blizzard with nothing but backpacks and determination. By the time Grace woke, rubbing sleep from her eyes and immediately asking for hot chocolate, they had breakfast well underway. Daniel had discovered that cooking for four again wasn't the burden he'd expected. There was something satisfying about cracking extra eggs, about hearing multiple voices around his table, about seeing the stack of plates dwindle in, the cabinet as they were put to use. "Can we go to the workshop today?" Grace asked through a mouthful of scrambled eggs. "I want to finish my project." "Grace, don't talk with your mouth full," Eleanor admonished gently, though without real heat. The eldest sister had relaxed marginally. Over the past days, some of her rigid control softening in the face of their host's continued acceptance. "It's up to Daniel," Charlotte said, glancing his way. "It's his workshop after all." Daniel found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided, weather's not getting any better. Might as well make the most of it. The smile that lit Grace's face was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "I'm going to finish my bird today. I think it needs a nest, though. Birds should have homes." Something about the simple statement touched a chord in Daniel. Birds should have homes. People too, he thought, looking at the three sisters who had lost theirs not once but twice. First with their father's death, then their mother's. After breakfast, they bundled up in now familiar layers and made the trek to the workshop, Grace insisting on leading the way despite having to wade through snow nearly to her waist in places. Daniel had given her a pair of Katherine's old snow boots the day before, stuffed with extra socks to make them fit her small feet. The sight had given him a momentary pang. Katherine had been saving those boots, keeping them in pristine condition, for the child they'd hoped for, the child that never came. Now they were finally serving their purpose, just not in the way either of them had imagined. The workshop welcomed them with its unique blend of scents, wood dust, linseed oil, the faint metallic tang of tools waiting to be used. Daniel lit the wood stove while the sisters moved to their respective projects from the day before, settling into what had become their usual places. Eleanor at the workbench nearest the door, Charlotte by the window where the light was best, Grace perched on a stool Daniel had modified to fit her height. For the next hours, they worked in a rhythm that had become surprisingly comfortable. Daniel moved between them, offering guidance, demonstrating techniques, answering questions. He found teaching oddly rewarding, the way Eleanor's focused determination gave way to quiet satisfaction when she mastered a difficult cut. How Charlotte's artistic intuition sometimes led her to solutions he wouldn't have considered. The pure joy on Grace's face when a shape emerged from the wood under her careful hands. It was during a quiet moment when everyone was absorbed in their work and the only sounds were the crackle of the wood stove and the soft rasp of sandpaper on wood that Grace broke the companionable silence. "My treasure box is almost done," she announced, holding up her creation. What had started as her piece of cherrywood was now taking shape as a small, simple box. Daniel had showed her how to create a basic finger joint construction, and she'd taken to it with surprising skill for her age. "Looks good," Daniel said, moving closer to inspect her work. "What will you keep in your treasure box?" Grace's expression grew suddenly solemn. "My special things, things from home and this." She reached inside the collar of her borrowed shirt and pulled out a slender chain with a small pendant hanging from it, a delicate crest or emblem of some kind, rendered in what looked like silver or white gold. At the sight of the necklace, Eleanor's head snapped up, her body visibly tensing. "Grace," she said, her voice tight with warning. But Grace, in the innocent way of children, continued, "It was Mama's. She gave one to each of us before she stopped abruptly, registering her oldest sister's expression. "Sorry, Ellie." An uncomfortable silence fell over the workshop. Charlotte had gone very still, her carving knife suspended over her half-finished bluebird. Eleanor's knuckles had gone white around the handle of her plane. Daniel deliberately kept his gaze on Grace's box, pretending not to have noticed the sister's reaction. "Those finger joints are looking real clean," he said, running a finger along the edge of the wood. "You've got a steady hand." Relief flickered across Eleanor's face at his apparent lack of interest in the necklace. Grace tucked it back inside her shirt and returned her attention to her box, the moment seemingly forgotten. But Daniel had seen, and more importantly, he'd seen Eleanor's reaction, the alarm, the protectiveness, the fear. The pendant had meant something beyond mere sentimental value. It was connected to whatever secret they were guarding so carefully. They worked for another hour before Daniel suggested they break for lunch. As they prepared to head back to the cabin, bundling up against the continuing snowfall, Eleanor touched his arm lightly. "Could I have a word?" she asked quietly, her eyes serious. Daniel nodded, hanging back as Charlotte helped Grace with her boots and coat. When the other two had gone ahead, trudging through the snow toward the cabin, Eleanor faced him directly. There was a new tension in her posture, a wariness that had been less pronounced in recent days. "About what Grace showed you," she began. Daniel shook his head. "You don't owe me explanations." Eleanor's shoulders remained rigid. "I know, but I need to ask you not to mention it. The necklace, it's important." "I figured as much," Daniel said, meeting her gaze steadily. "Look, Eleanor, I don't know what you three are running from, and I'm not asking, but you're safe here for as long as you need to be. That's all that matters right now." Something flickered in her eyes, a complicated mix of gratitude, suspicion, and what might have been hope. "Why are you helping us?" she asked suddenly. "You don't know us. We could be anyone." The question caught Daniel off guard with its directness. Why was he helping them? The simplest answer was also the truest. "Because you needed help," he said. "And maybe I did too." Eleanor studied his face, searching for something. Dishonesty, perhaps, or hidden motives. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said quietly. Then, with characteristic practicality, she added, "We should get back before Grace talks Charlotte's ear off about her treasure box." The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, a fragile trust beginning to form, still tentative but real. Back at the cabin, lunch was a simple affair of sandwiches and canned soup, the conversation lighter as Grace regaled them with elaborate plans for her completed box. Charlotte had brought her sketchbook, adding to her drawing of the snow-covered landscape while she ate, her attention divided between her art and her meal. "The radio says the snow might stop tonight," Daniel mentioned as they finished eating. "Still be a day or two before the roads are passable, though." "How far are we from town?" Charlotte asked, looking up from her sketch. "About 15 miles by road," Daniel replied. Less as the crow flies, but the terrain's rough, ravines, creek beds. Not something you'd want to tackle on foot, especially in snow this deep. Eleanor's expression remained neutral, but Daniel sensed she was filing this information away, adding it to whatever calculations were always running behind her careful eyes. "Will your truck be able to get through once the main road is plowed?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Eventually. Might take some digging out, but she's built for these conditions." Another piece of information catalogued. Daniel could almost see Eleanor. Adjusting plans, considering options. Always thinking ahead, this girl. Always prepared for contingencies. After lunch, they returned to the workshop, falling back into their now familiar routine. Daniel found himself drawn to the unfinished rocking chair, Katherine's chair, that had stood abandoned for so long. He ran his hands over the smooth curves of the armrests, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingers. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, having approached quietly while he was lost in thought. "Even unfinished." Daniel nodded. She wanted it for the front porch, for summer evenings. "You could finish it," Eleanor suggested gently. "We could help." Daniel looked at her, struck by the simple offer. This girl, with her own burdens, her own losses, offering to help him complete what grief had forced him to abandon. "Maybe," he said, not quite a commitment, but no longer a refusal. "It's the carving that's left, the lilies on the headrest. Those take a steady hand." "Charlotte has the steadiest hands I've ever seen," Eleanor said, glancing toward her sister, who was working intently on her bluebird carving. "And patience. She could help with that part." Daniel considered this. The idea of completing Katherine's chair with help, with these hands that had unexpectedly entered his life, felt right, somehow, as if Katherine herself might have approved of the collaboration. "We'll see," he said, which wasn't a no. Eleanor seemed to understand, offering a small nod before returning to her own project, a small jewelry box she'd been crafting with meticulous care, practicing dovetail joints until they fit with seamless precision. The afternoon passed in productive concentration, the workshop warm with the heat of the wood stove and alive with the sounds of creation, the rasp of planes, the tap of mallets, the soft swish of sandpaper. Outside, the snow continued to fall, though with less intensity than before. The world beyond the workshop windows was a study in white and grey, broken only by the dark shapes of trees and the distant outline of the mountains. It was nearly dusk when Grace, who had been unusually quiet for the past hour, let out a small cry of dismay. Daniel looked up to see her staring at her treasure box, tears welling in her eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked, moving to her side. "I broke it," she said, her voice small and devastated. She held up the box, showing where one of the carefully crafted corners had split along the grain. "I was trying to make it perfect, and I pressed. Too hard." Daniel examined the break, relief washing over him. "This is fixable," he assured her. "See? The wood split cleanly. We can glue it back together, reinforce it with a small dowel." Grace looked up at him, hope dawning through her tears. "Really? It won't be ruined." "Not ruined," Daniel confirmed. "Just needs some healing. Sometimes the strongest joints are the ones that have been broken and repaired." He glanced up to find Eleanor watching them, something unreadable in her expression. "The Japanese have a technique called kintsugi," he continued. "They repair broken pottery with gold, making the repaired piece even more valuable than before, highlighting the breaks instead of hiding them. Making the broken place beautiful," Charlotte said thoughtfully, having joined them. Daniel nodded. "Exactly. We don't have gold, but we could inlay a thin strip of maple along the repaired joint. It would stand out against the cherry, make a feature of the mend." And Grace's tears had dried, her expression now curious rather than devastated. "Could we really do that?" "We can try," Daniel said. "First thing tomorrow, we'll fix it together." The promise seemed to satisfy Grace. who carefully placed her damaged box on the workbench, ready for tomorrow's repair. As they prepared to head back to the cabin for the evening, Charlotte lingered, waiting until Grace and Eleanor had gone ahead. "I was wondering," she said, her eyes on the half-finished rocking chair, "if you'd show me how to carve the lilies." "Not to do it for you," she added quickly, "just to learn how." There was a gentleness in her question, an understanding of the emotional weight the chair carried. Daniel felt a rush of gratitude for this perceptive girl who somehow knew to approach the subject with such care. "I'd like that," he found himself saying. "Katherine would have liked that too, I think." Charlotte smiled, a quiet, satisfied expression. "Tomorrow, then." The evening meal was more substantial than usual, a stew Daniel had started in the slow cooker before they left for the workshop, made with the last of his fresh vegetables and some dried herbs Katherine had grown the previous summer. The rich aroma filled the cabin, drawing appreciative comments from the sisters as they shed their outer layers and gathered in the warmth of the kitchen. "That smells amazing," Charlotte said, peering into the pot as Daniel gave it a final stir. "Katherine's recipe," he explained. "She called it end-of-winter stew for using up whatever was left before spring planting." "Our mother had something similar," Eleanor said, helping to set the table, "though she called it clean the pantry. Soup!" A small smile touched her lips at the memory. "It was never the same twice." "Those are the best recipes," Daniel agreed, "the improvisational ones." As they settled around the table, the howling of the wind that had been their constant companion for days had noticeably lessened. The storm was finally beginning to abate, just as the weather report had predicted. "Listen," Grace said suddenly, her head tilted. "It's quiet." And it was a strange, almost eerie silence after so many days of constant wind and snow. The world outside seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. "Storm's breaking," Daniel confirmed. "Probably clear by morning." The observation hung in the air, carrying implications none of them were quite ready to address. Clear weather meant roads would eventually be plowed. It meant communications restored, travel possible. It meant decisions would need to be made. They ate in a more subdued mood than usual, each lost in their own thoughts about what the changing weather might bring. Grace was the first to break the contemplative silence. "Mr. Daniel," she began, setting down her spoon, "do you have a telephone?" The question seemed innocuous enough, but Daniel noticed how Eleanor tensed slightly, her gaze sharpening. "Landline," he confirmed, "though it's been down since the storm hit. Cell service out here is spotty at best, even in good weather." "When it works again," Grace continued, "could we call Mrs. Wilson at the store to ask about our car?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Sure, though I doubt they've been able to reach it yet. It'll be buried pretty deep by now." Eleanor cleared her throat. "We should probably consider other options anyway," she said carefully. "The car, it wasn't ours." Daniel raised an eyebrow, but didn't immediately comment. "We borrowed it," Charlotte added, her gaze fixed on her bowl, "from a friend of our mother's, but we can't go back there." "I see," Daniel said, though of course he didn't, not fully. Another piece of the puzzle, but the full picture remained elusive. "We have money," Eleanor said quickly, as if anticipating his concerns, "for bus tickets, once we can get to town." "To where?" Daniel asked, the question escaping before he could consider whether it was his place to ask. A look passed between the sisters, that silent communication he'd come to recognize but couldn't interpret. "West," Eleanor said finally. "We have family in California." The slight hesitation told Daniel this wasn't exactly true, or at least not the whole truth. But he nodded, accepting the answer at face value. "Well, no rush to figure it all out. And tonight," he said, rising to clear the dishes, "roads won't be passable for a couple days at least, and you're welcome to stay until then." Relief visibly washed over all three sisters, though Eleanor still maintained her guarded composure. "Thank you," she said. "We appreciate everything you've done for us." Something in her tone, a finality perhaps, made Daniel pause. "Is there something else on your mind, Eleanor?" She hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "Actually, yes. I think it's time we were honest with you. About why we're here, why we're running." Charlotte looked up sharply. "Ellie, are you sure?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "He deserves to know, especially after everything he's done for us." She turned back to Daniel. "After the girls are in bed, if that's all right." Daniel felt a weight settle in his chest, anticipation mixed with concern. Whatever secret these girls had been guarding, Eleanor was finally ready to share it. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. "Whenever you're ready," he said simply. The remainder of the evening passed in a strange mix of normalcy and tension. They cleaned up dinner together, as had become their routine. Grace worked on a drawing at the kitchen table, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Charlotte disappeared into the guest room for a while, emerging with a small parcel wrapped in tissue paper that she tucked carefully into her backpack without explanation. Eleanor moved through these activities with a kind of controlled energy, her mind clearly elsewhere. Once Daniel caught her standing by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with an expression so complex and troubled that he had to look away, feeling as though he'd intruded on something deeply private. When it was time for Grace to go to bed, the youngest sister wrapped her arms around Daniel's waist in an impulsive hug. "Thank you for saying you'll fix my box tomorrow," she said, her voice muffled against his sweater. Startled by the unexpected physical contact, Daniel stood frozen for a moment before awkwardly patting her back. "Of course," he managed. "That's a promise." Grace beamed up at him, then turned to follow Charlotte to the guest room they shared, utterly unaware of the emotional weight gathering in the cabin like storm clouds. Once the younger girls had settled, Eleanor rejoined Daniel in the living room. She sat on the edge of the couch, her posture rigid, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows across her young face, highlighting the tension in her jaw, the resolve in her eyes. "I don't know where to start," she admitted after a long moment of silence. Daniel settled into his chair across from her, deliberately keeping his posture open, non-threatening. "Wherever feels right," he said. "Or nowhere at all, if you've changed. Your mind, like I said before, you don't owe me explanations." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "But I do," she said quietly. "Because whatever happens next, you've given us something precious, safety, kindness, a chance to breathe." She took a deep breath, as if drawing courage from the very air. "And because we might need your help to get away safely." The blunt admission hung in the air between them. "Are you in danger?" Daniel asked, his voice lowering instinctively. Eleanor considered the question. "Yes," she said finally, "but not in the way you might think." She reached into the collar of her shirt and withdrew a necklace identical to the one Grace had shown earlier, a slender chain with a small, intricate pendant. In the firelight, Daniel could now see that it was indeed crafted from white gold. The emblem a delicate coat of arms with what appeared to be a tiny ruby at its center. "Do you recognize this?" she asked, holding it up so the pendant caught the light. Daniel shook his head. "Should I?" "Probably not," Eleanor acknowledged. "Most Americans wouldn't. It's the royal crest of Valoria." The name meant nothing to Daniel. Some small European country, he assumed. "It's a small principality," Eleanor continued, as if reading his thoughts, "nestled between Austria and Italy. Not even 20,000 citizens. Mostly known for banking and skiing, if it's known at all." Daniel waited, sensing there was much more to come. "Our mother was born there," Eleanor said. her fingers curling around the pendant protectively. Her name was Princess Helena Katalin Rosalia von Valorian. She was the youngest daughter of the Grand Duke. Daniel felt his eyebrows rise involuntarily. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't this. She fell in love with an American exchange student, Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a story she'd heard many times. Our father, Richard Winters, a nobody by royal standards, a scholarship student studying international finance. A small, sad smile touched her lips. The Grand Duke forbade the match, of course, threatened to disown her, so she ran away. Came to America with our father, cut all ties with Valoria. That's quite a story, Daniel said carefully, unsure what to make of it. Eleanor's gaze remained steady. It gets more complicated. The Grand Duke, our grandfather, died 3 months ago, without a male heir. His eldest daughter, our Aunt Sophia, was next in line, but there was a condition in his will. She took another deep breath. He'd been searching for our mother for years. Never stopped, apparently. When he couldn't find her, he stipulated that if Helena or her heirs could be located within 6 months of his death, the succession would pass to them instead of Sophia. The pieces were beginning to fall into place for Daniel. So you're saying, our mother knew? None of this until a Valorian lawyer found her last year, Eleanor explained. By then, she was already sick, heart problems that she'd hidden from us. She refused to return to Valoria, refused to claim the title or the inheritance, said she'd made her choice long ago. Her voice wavered slightly. But when she realized she was dying, she gave us these. She touched the pendant again. One for each of us, said we might need them someday to prove who we are. And now she's gone, Daniel said softly, understanding dawning. And your Aunt Sophia knows about you. Eleanor nodded grimly. The Valorian lawyer contacted us after the funeral, said we were in danger, that Sophia would do anything to prevent us from claiming our inheritance, or worse, being used as figureheads by the opposition party in Valoria that wants to restore direct succession. So you ran, Daniel concluded. We ran, Eleanor confirmed, left everything behind. The lawyer helped us at first, gave us money, the car, but then he disappeared. We think Sophia's people found him. Fear flickered across her face. Then we started noticing men watching the house, following us. That's when we decided to head west, try to lose them. The storm wasn't planned, but it might have saved your lives, Daniel finished for her. Eleanor nodded slowly. I think so, but they're still looking for us, and once the road's clear, the implications hung heavy in the air. 3 young girls with royal blood carrying proof of their identity around their necks. A fortune and a title waiting for them in a country they'd never seen, and people willing to do anything to prevent them from claiming it. Why tell me this now? Daniel asked quietly. Eleanor met his gaze directly. Because we need to leave as soon as the roads are passable, before anyone can track us here. But we need help getting away clean, somewhere they won't think to look. Oh, for us, she hesitated. And because if something happens to me, I needed someone else to know the truth, for Charlotte and Grace's sake. The weight of the responsibility she was placing on his shoulders wasn't lost on Daniel. This was more than a request for a ride to town, more than temporary shelter. Eleanor was entrusting him with their lives, their future, their very identity. I'm just a woodworker, he said quietly. Not sure how much help I can be against people like that. You're more than that, Eleanor replied with surprising certainty. You're someone who keeps his word, someone who helped 3 strangers in a storm without question, someone who showed Grace how to make broken things beautiful again. Her voice softened. That's exactly the kind of person we need right now. Daniel looked at her, really looked, and saw beneath the composure and determination to the scared 17-year-old who'd had to become a parent overnight, who was carrying not just the weight of her sister's physical safety, but the burden of a heritage she'd never asked for. "Okay," he said simply, "we'll figure something out." The relief that washed over Eleanor's face was palpable, some of the rigid tension finally leaving her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. As she rose to join her sisters in the guest room, Eleanor paused at the doorway. "There's money," she said. "A lot of money, in accounts our mother set up, if we can just stay safe long enough to access it." She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "I'm not interested in titles or being a princess. I just want Charlotte and Grace to be safe, to have a chance at a normal life." Daniel nodded, understanding. "Get some rest," he said gently. "We'll talk more tomorrow." After Eleanor had gone, Daniel remained by the fire, his mind racing with all he'd learned. 3 orphaned sisters with royal blood, a distant throne, dangerous pursuers. It seemed fantastical, like something from one of the novels Katherine had loved to read, and yet there had been no deception in Eleanor's eyes, no hint of fabrication in her story. The pendant she wore was clearly valuable, clearly meaningful, and it would explain so much. The formal way the girls sometimes spoke, the careful manners that seemed beyond their years, the way Eleanor carried herself with an almost regal dignity despite their circumstances. Outside, the storm had indeed begun to break, the clouds thinning to reveal glimpses of stars between racing wisps of vapor. The world was emerging from its white cocoon, which meant connections would soon be re-established, roads would open, and the fragile sanctuary of Aspen Creek Farm would once again be linked to the wider world, with all its dangers and complexities. Daniel added another log to the fire, watching as sparks spiraled up the chimney. Katherine would have known what to do, he thought. She had always been the one with intuition, with a sense for navigating the unpredictable currents of life. But Katherine was gone. And now 3 young lives had been placed in his care, not just for shelter from a storm, but for protection against forces he could barely comprehend. For the first time in a long while, Daniel found himself praying, not with words or formal thoughts, but with the deep, wordless longing of a heart reaching for guidance beyond itself. Something important was happening here at Aspen Creek Farm, something that felt like purpose, like meaning returning to a life that had lost its compass. As the fire burned low and the night deepened around the cabin, Daniel made a silent promise. To Katherine, to himself, to 3 girls who had arrived in a blizzard, carrying royal secrets and wounded hearts. He would help them, however he could, whatever it took. In the morning, they would begin to make plans. But for now, in this moment of quiet between storm and clear skies, Daniel allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. The stirring of hope, fragile but persistent, like the first green shoot breaking through frozen ground after a long winter. Morning arrived with blinding brilliance, sunlight reflecting off the endless white landscape surrounding Aspen Creek Farm. The storm had broken during the night, leaving behind a crystalline sky of perfect blue and a world transformed by snow. Daniel stood on the porch, coffee steaming in his hands, watching as the first rays of sun touched the roof of his workshop, turning the snow-laden eaves to gold. The beauty was almost painful in its intensity, the kind of morning that made you believe in new beginnings, in possibilities, the kind of morning Katherine had loved. Daniel drew a deep breath of the crisp, cold air, his mind still processing Eleanor's revelations from the night before. 3 royal heirs, hiding from those who would prevent them from claiming their birthright. It sounded impossible, like something from a fairy tale rather than real life. And yet, the pendant Eleanor had shown him, the formal way the girls sometimes spoke, their careful manners, it all made a strange kind of sense. The creak of the door behind him announced Eleanor's presence before she spoke. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, stepping out to join him on the porch, her own mug of coffee cradled in her hands. In the clear morning light, she looked both older and younger than her 17 years, responsibility having carved maturity into her features, while sleep had softened some of the vigilance from her eyes. First day without snow in almost a week, Daniel observed. Roads might start clearing by tomorrow. Eleanor nodded, her gaze sweeping the pristine landscape. "I've been thinking," she said after a moment, "about what happens next." Daniel glanced at her sidelong. "And?" "We need to get to San Francisco," she said. "There's a Valorian consulate there. Our mother's lawyer said they could help us. There's a faction within the diplomatic corps that remains loyal to our family line." She took a sip of her coffee. "The problem is getting there without being tracked." "You think your aunt's people know you're in Colorado?" Eleanor frowned. "I don't know. They were following us in Nebraska. We thought we'd lost them when we headed into the mountains, but..." She shook her head. "I can't be sure." Daniel considered this. "The car you were driving, if they find it, they'll know you were headed this way." "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed, a hint of approval in her voice at his quick understanding. "And once the road's clear, they'll be searching this area." "So we need to get you somewhere else," Daniel said, thinking aloud. "Somewhere they wouldn't think to look." Eleanor nodded. "And we need new transportation, something that can't be traced back to us." Daniel took a long sip of his coffee, his mind working through the practical aspects of the problem. "I might have an idea," he said finally. "My brother-in-law, Jim, Katherine's brother, he lives in Grand Junction, about 4 hours west of here. He's..." Daniel paused, considering how to describe the man who'd been his friend long before becoming his brother-in-law. "He's good at solving problems, knows people, and he owes me a favor." "Can he be trusted?" Eleanor asked, the wariness returning to her eyes. "No offense, but the fewer people who know about us, the safer we all are." "Jim's solid," Daniel assured her. "Ex-military. Doesn't ask questions he doesn't need answers to." He hesitated, then added, "He was Katherine's only family. Took her death almost as hard as I did." This seemed to register with Eleanor. She nodded slowly. "Okay, if you trust him, that's good enough for me." The simple statement, her willingness to place her trust in his judgment, despite all she'd been through, touched Daniel unexpectedly. This girl, who had every reason to be suspicious of adults and their motives, was choosing to believe in him. "The phone lines should be back up soon," he said. "I'll call him, see what he can arrange." Eleanor's shoulders relaxed marginally. "Thank you," she said quietly. Then, her voice dropping further, "I haven't told Charlotte and Grace everything yet about the danger we might be in. I didn't want to frighten them more than necessary." "Might be time," Daniel suggested gently. "Charlotte, at least, seems old enough to handle the truth." Eleanor nodded, though reluctance was clear in the set of her mouth. "You're right, I wanted them to have a few days of feeling safe." She glanced toward the door. "I'll talk to Charlotte this morning." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Charlotte appeared in the doorway, bundled in one of Katherine's old sweaters, her wild hair contained in a loose braid. "Morning," she said, her eyes widening at the transformed landscape. "Wow, everything looks different." "Amazing what a little sunlight can do," Daniel agreed, making room for her on the porch. Charlotte stepped out, turning her face up to the sun like a flower seeking warmth. "Are we going to the workshop today?" she asked. "I want to finish my bluebird, and you promised to show me how to carve lilies." The simple request, delivered with such easy certainty that today would continue the rhythms they'd established over the past days, made something twist in Daniel's chest. These girls had found a fragile peace here at Aspen Creek, a temporary respite from the chaos of their lives, and soon that peace would be shattered again. "Of course," he said. "After breakfast." Eleanor shot him a grateful look. One more day of normalcy before they had to face what came next. One more day to be children, or as close to children as their circumstances allowed. Grace joined them soon after, still sleepy-eyed but immediately animated when she saw the clear skies. "Can we build a snowman?" she asked, bouncing on her toes. "Please." After the workshop, Eleanor promised, when the snows had a chance to soften in the sun. Breakfast was a cheerful affair, with Grace chattering about her plans for decorating her treasure box once it was repaired, and Charlotte describing the lily design she wanted to try carving. Eleanor seemed content to listen, adding a comment here and there, but mostly watching her sisters with a soft expression that didn't quite mask the worry in her eyes. Daniel found himself watching all three of them, trying to memorize the scene, the way Grace's nose scrunched when she laughed, the focused furrow that appeared between Charlotte's brows when she was thinking deeply. The protective way Eleanor always made sure her sisters had what they needed before serving herself. In just a few days, these girls had transformed his silent, empty home into something warm and alive. The thought of them leaving, of the cabin returning to its previous state of echoing hollowness, was more painful than he cared to admit. After breakfast, they made their now familiar trek to the workshop, though the journey was more challenging than before. The snow had drifted in places to waist height, forcing them to forge a new path through the deepest sections. Grace insisted on trying to walk through one such drift herself, only to disappear up to her shoulders with a shriek of surprised laughter. Daniel had to lift her out, her small body surprisingly light in his arms. "You're strong," she declared, as he set her back on more solid footing. "Years of hauling lumber," Daniel explained, oddly pleased by her assessment. The workshop welcomed them with its familiar scents and shadowed corners. Daniel lit the wood stove while the girls moved to their respective projects, settling into the routine they'd established over the past days. But there was a different quality to the atmosphere today, a sense of finality, of preciousness. They all seemed to feel it, working with a focused intensity that hadn't been present before. True to his promise, Daniel helped Grace repair her treasure box first. He showed her how to prepare the broken pieces, applying glue carefully and clamping them together. "Now we wait for that to dry," he explained. "Then we'll inlay the maple strip to make it stronger and more beautiful." Grace nodded solemnly, watching the clamped box, as if her gaze alone could speed the drying process. "Will it really be stronger than before?" she asked. "In that spot, yes," Daniel confirmed. "The glue, plus the inlay, that joint won't break." Again, Grace considered this, her young face thoughtful. "Maybe that's true for people too," she suggested. "Maybe when something breaks us and we fix it, we're stronger there." Daniel glanced at her in surprise, struck by the wisdom in her words. "That's a pretty profound thought for someone your age," he said. Grace shrugged. "Our mom used to say something like that, after our dad died, that we were broken, but not ruined." Her voice softened. "She said we'd find our gold someday." Daniel's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Your mom sounds like she was very wise." "She was," Grace agreed. Then, with the resilience of childhood, she brightened. "Can we start on the inlay while we wait for the glue?" "Sure," Daniel said, grateful for the shift back to practical matters. "Let's pick out a nice piece of maple." While Daniel worked with Grace, Charlotte had settled at the workbench near the window, where the morning light illuminated the half-finished rocking chair. She had her sketchbook open beside her, several quick drawings of lily patterns scattered across the page. "Ready to learn about relief carving?" Daniel asked, approaching after ensuring Grace was settled with her maple selection. Charlotte nodded eagerly. "I think I want to try this pattern," she said, pointing to one of her sketches, a graceful arrangement of 3 lilies with intertwining stems, simpler than what Daniel had originally planned, but beautiful in its clean lines. "Good choice," he approved. "Let's start with the basic tools and technique." For the next hour, Daniel guided Charlotte through the fundamentals of relief carving, how to hold the tools, how to follow the grain, how to create depth and dimension with careful, patient cuts. She took to it with natural aptitude, her artistic eye allowing her to see the potential in the wood before the cuts were even made. "You have a gift for this," Daniel observed as he watched her complete a practice piece, a simple leaf carved into a scrap of pine. Charlotte looked up, her face flushed with pleasure at the praise. "It feels right," she admitted. "Like the wood wants to be carved." Daniel nodded in understanding. "The best pieces are like that, a collaboration between the woodworker and the material. You don't force it, you reveal what's already there, waiting." "Is that how you feel when you work?" she asked, setting down her carving tool. Daniel considered the question seriously. "When it's going well, yes, though I haven't felt that flow in a while. Since Katherine died," Charlotte said softly, not a question. Daniel nodded, unable to form words for a moment. Charlotte's gaze was gentle, understanding beyond her years. "Maybe it's time to find it again," she suggested. "Not to replace what you lost, but because creating beautiful things is part of who you are." The simple observation, so similar to what Katherine herself might have said, landed with unexpected weight. Daniel cleared his throat. "Maybe you're right." From across the workshop, Eleanor had been watching this exchange, her own project, temporarily forgotten. There was something wistful in her expression, a longing that spoke of dreams deferred, of a childhood cut short by responsibility. Daniel caught her eye and gestured for her to join them. "Want to try your hand at carving?" he offered. Eleanor hesitated, then set down her plane and approached. "I'm not artistic like Charlotte," she demurred. "Doesn't matter," Daniel said. "It's not about making something perfect. It's about the process." After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor picked up one of the carving tools, testing its weight in her hand. "Show me," she said. For the rest of the morning, they worked together on the rocking chair, Daniel guiding, Charlotte and Eleanor carving with different but complementary styles. Even Grace joined in after a while, sitting on Daniel's lap as he helped her make simple cuts in one of the less visible areas of the headrest. It was collaborative in a way woodworking had never been for Daniel before. Usually a solitary pursuit, a private conversation between himself and the wood. But there was something deeply satisfying about this shared creation, about watching three pairs of hands bringing Katherine's chair to life in ways he couldn't have managed alone. By midday, the lily pattern was taking shape. Not exactly as Daniel had originally envisioned it, but somehow more meaningful for the variations in style that marked each sister's contribution. Charlotte's sections showed her artistic flair, Eleanor's her precision and attention to detail, Grace's the simple joy of creation. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said softly, stepping back to view their collective work. "More beautiful than if just one person had done it." Daniel nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Katherine would have loved it," he managed to say. "The collaboration, the story behind it." They broke for lunch, returning to the cabin where the sun streamed through the windows, casting pools of light across the wooden floors. As they ate sandwiches at the kitchen table, Daniel noticed Eleanor and Charlotte exchanging looks, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Grace," Eleanor said finally, "why don't you get your drawing stuff? You can work at the table while Charlotte and I help Daniel with the dishes." It was a transparent excuse for the younger girl to be occupied while the older ones talked. But Grace didn't seem to notice, happily retrieving her sketchbook and pencils from the living room. Once Grace was absorbed in her drawing, Eleanor led the way to the sink, where she began washing dishes with mechanical efficiency, her mind clearly elsewhere. "I spoke with Eleanor this morning," Charlotte said quietly to Daniel as she took a plate to dry, "about everything." Daniel nodded, understanding she meant their royal heritage and the danger they faced. "How are you feeling about it?" he asked. Charlotte considered this, her movements with the towel slowing. "Scared," she admitted. "But also, I don't know. Like maybe there's a reason for all of this. For ending up here with you." She glanced toward Grace, still happily drawing at the table. "I don't care about being a princess or having money. I just want us to be safe. Together." "That's what's going to happen," Daniel assured her, his voice low but firm. "We're going to make sure of it." The phone rang then, a startling sound after days of silence. Daniel moved to answer it, aware of the sudden tension that had entered Eleanor's posture. "Morgan," he answered. "Danny, thank God." It was Martha Wilson's voice, crackling with relief. "Been trying to reach you since the lines came back up. You all right out there?" "Fine, Martha," he assured her. "Got plenty of supplies, generators working. How's town?" "Digging out," Martha reported. "Power's back in most places. Roads are starting to clear. Should have the main highway passable by tomorrow. County roads the day after." She paused. "Danny, there's something else. There's been people asking about those girls." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. "What people?" "Two men," Martha said, her voice lowering as if they might overhear foreign accents. "Said they were family friends, looking for three sisters whose car went off the road during the storm. Showed photos and everything." Daniel's gaze met Eleanor's across the kitchen. She had gone very still, her hands suspended in the soapy water, her face pale. "What did you tell them?" he asked Martha carefully. "Nothing to tell," Martha replied, a hint of defiance in her tone. "Far as I know, no one's seen any girls like that around here. That's what everybody said." A pause. "Danny, is there something I should know?" Daniel weighed his options quickly. Martha was trustworthy, had been a friend to both him and Katherine for years, but the less she knew, the safer she'd be. "Better if you don't," he said finally. "But thank you, Martha, for the warning." "They're still in town," she informed him, "staying at the motel. Said they're waiting for the roads to clear so they can check the back country." Another pause. "Whatever's going on, you be careful, Danny, and those girls too." "We will," he promised. "Thanks again, Martha." As he hung up, Eleanor was already moving, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "They found us," she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Not yet," Daniel corrected, "but they're close. We need to move fast." Eleanor nodded, her mind visibly racing. "How long do we have?" Daniel considered what Martha had said. "County road to my place probably won't be plowed until the day after tomorrow. But if these men are determined enough, they might try to get through earlier." "Then we need to be gone by tomorrow," Eleanor concluded, "before they can reach us." "What about your brother-in-law?" Charlotte asked, her face tense with worry. "Can he help?" Daniel glanced at the phone. "Let me find out." Jim answered on the third ring, his gruff voice a familiar comfort. After briefly confirming that they'd both weathered the storm without incident, Daniel cut to the chase. "Jim, I need a favor. A big one." "Name it," Jim replied without hesitation. "I need transportation for 4 people to Grand Junction tomorrow. No questions asked, no paper trail." There was a brief silence on the line. "You in some kind of trouble, Danny?" "Not me," Daniel replied. "Some friends. Good people who need help." Another pause. "This have anything to do with those 3 girls that went missing during the storm? The ones those European fellows are looking for?" Daniel shouldn't have been surprised that Jim was already aware of the situation. Grand Junction was a much larger town than Pinecrest Valley, but news traveled fast in these parts. "Yes," he admitted, "and those men aren't friends of the family, whatever they're claiming." "Figured as much," Jim said. "Something off about them." A moment of consideration. "Okay, here's what we'll do. I've got a buddy with the snowmobile tour business. He owes me. I'll have him bring 3 machines to the highway junction near Miller's Creek tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. That's about 5 miles from your place, but it's the closest accessible point. Until they plow your road. We can make that, Daniel confirmed, mentally mapping the route. It would be a difficult trek through deep snow, but doable. He'll transport you to a private airfield outside Grand Junction, Jim continued. I know. A pilot there, ex-Air Force, doesn't ask questions. She can take you wherever you need to go from there. Daniel felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Jim, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, Jim replied. There's a storm front moving in from the west. Should hit late tomorrow. If you're not at that junction by 8, the window closes. A pause. And Danny, be careful. Whoever these guys are, they've got resources. They've been flashing some serious cash around town. We will, Daniel promised. I'll explain everything when I see you. Looking forward to it, Jim said. It's been too long. After hanging up, Daniel relayed the plan to Eleanor and Charlotte, aware of Grace still drawing contentedly at the table, oblivious to the tension filling the kitchen. 5 miles through snow, Eleanor said, her brow furrowed in calculation. With Grace, that's going to be tough. I can carry her part of the way, Daniel offered. We'll make it. Charlotte nodded, determination replacing some of the fear in her eyes. We've come this far, we can do 5 more miles. Eleanor's gaze moved to her youngest sister, her expression softening with a mixture of love and worry. We'll need to pack light, just essentials. And we'll need to leave before dawn, Daniel added. Give ourselves plenty of time to reach the junction by 8. A plan was forming, practical details falling into place. But beneath the logistics, Daniel felt a deeper current of emotion, a growing certainty that this was not just about helping these girls escape danger. This was about something more profound, finding purpose again, rediscovering the man he'd been before grief had hollowed him out. What about your woodworking? Charlotte asked suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. Your home? Daniel looked around the kitchen, at the cabin he and Katherine had built together, the life they'd created in this remote corner of the mountains. For so long, he'd been haunting these rooms rather than living in them, clinging to memories that grew more painful with each passing day. Some things are worth leaving behind, he said carefully, and others are worth taking with you. He met Eleanor's gaze steadily. I'm coming with you to San Francisco. All the way. Surprise flickered across Eleanor's face. Daniel, you don't have to. I know, he interrupted gently. I want to. You 3 shouldn't face this alone. The relief that washed over both sisters' faces told him he'd made the right decision. For them, but also for himself. What about Grace? Charlotte asked softly, glancing toward her youngest sister. Should we tell her everything now? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Tonight, after we finish at the workshop, let her have one more day of just being a child. They spent the afternoon completing their projects in the workshop, each piece now taking on new significance as something they would carry with them into an uncertain future. Grace's treasure box was successfully repaired, the maple inlay creating a striking accent against the cherry wood. A beautiful scar that told the story of breaking and mending. Charlotte finished her bluebird carving, adding delicate feather, details that brought the wooden creature to life. Eleanor completed her jewelry box, its dovetailed joints fitting together with flawless precision. And the rocking chair, Katherine's chair, progressed toward completion, the lily pattern on its headrest a testament to 4 pairs of hands working in harmony. It wouldn't be finished before they had to leave, but Daniel found he didn't mind. Something felt right about leaving it in the workshop, waiting for his return. A promise to himself that this departure wasn't permanent, that some journeys circle back to their beginnings. As the afternoon light began to wane, they gathered their creations and prepared to return to the cabin. Daniel paused at the workshop door, looking back at the space that had once been his sanctuary. Then his prison, and now, somehow, a place of healing. Thank you, he said quietly to the empty room, to Katherine's memory, to whatever twist of fate had brought 3 lost girls to his door in the middle of a blizzard. Back at the cabin, they worked together to build the snowman Grace had been wanting, a lopsided creation with pine cone eyes and a carrot nose from Daniel's limited stores. Grace named him Herbert, declaring him the official guardian of Aspen Creek Farm while they were away, a statement that made Eleanor and Charlotte exchange worried glances. After dinner, while the last light of day faded from the sky, Eleanor sat Grace down in the living room for the conversation they'd been postponing. Daniel and Charlotte remained nearby, offering silent support as Eleanor carefully explained their royal heritage, the danger they faced, and the journey they would begin the next morning. Grace listened with unusual stillness, her small face solemn as she absorbed her sister's words. When Eleanor finished, silence hung in the room for a long moment. "So we're really princesses?" Grace asked finally. "Like in the stories Mom used to tell us?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "But being a princess isn't like in stories, Grace. It's complicated, dangerous sometimes." Grace nodded, digesting this. "And the bad men looking for us. They work for our aunt, who doesn't want us to be princesses instead of her." "Something like that," Eleanor agreed, clearly trying to simplify the complex political realities of their situation. Grace considered this for another moment, then asked the question that mattered most to her 9-year-old heart. "But we'll stay together, right? You, me, and Charlie." "Always," Eleanor promised, pulling her youngest sister into a fierce hug. "No matter what." Charlotte joined the embrace, the 3 sisters holding each other tight, their royal blood and grand inheritance momentarily irrelevant compared to the bond they shared. Daniel watched from a respectful distance, affected more deeply than he'd expected by the simple scene. Family, not by title or inheritance, but by love and shared struggle. It was what Katherine had wanted for them, what they'd planned together in those early years at Aspen Creek. A family of their own. Perhaps, in a way he could never have anticipated, that dream was being fulfilled after all. The evening was spent in preparations, packing the few belongings the girls had arrived with, plus warm clothes borrowed from Daniel's and Katherine's closets. Each sister carefully wrapped her wooden creation in cloth, these handmade treasures now among their most precious possessions. Daniel packed his own small bag, including practical necessities, but also a few items that held meaning. The wooden horse from the windowsill, a photo of Katherine, the wedding ring he'd stopped wearing months ago, but now slipped into his pocket like a talisman. As they worked, a sense of purposeful calm settled over the cabin. There was fear, yes, for the difficult journey ahead, for the confrontation that might await them at its end. But there was also determination, a collective resolve to face whatever came next together. When the preparations were complete, they gathered in the living room, the fireplace casting flickering light across their faces. Outside, the temperature was dropping rapidly, stars appearing in a sky now crystalline with cold. In the distance, Daniel could just make out the faint smudge of clouds on the western horizon. The approaching storm front Jim had warned about. "We should get some sleep," he suggested. "Dawn will come early." The sisters nodded, though none of them made an immediate move to retire. There was a reluctance in the air, a sense that once they slept, this interlude at Aspen Creek would truly be ending. "I was so angry when our car went off the road," Eleanor admitted suddenly. "I thought it was the worst luck, getting stranded in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard." A small smile touched her lips. "Now I think it might have been the best thing that could have happened to us." "Finding shelter in the storm," Charlotte agreed softly. "Finding Daniel," Grace added with childish directness. Daniel felt something catch in his throat. "I think we found each other," he said, "when we all needed it most." Eleanor met his gaze, a depth of gratitude in her eyes that required no words. Then she stood, practical as always. 6 hours until we need to be up, she said. We should rest while we can. As the sisters prepared for bed, Daniel made one last circuit of the cabin, checking windows, banking the fire, ensuring everything was ready for their pre-dawn departure. In the kitchen, he paused, his gaze falling on Katherine's recipe box, sitting on the counter where it had always been. He opened it, fingers finding the card for her end-of-winter stew, her handwriting neat and familiar on the yellowed paper. On impulse, he tucked the card into his pocket alongside the ring. Some things couldn't be left behind. Later, lying in his bed for what might be the last time, Daniel found his thoughts clearer than they had been in months. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but it no longer defined him completely. Katherine was gone, but the love remained, transmuted now into something that could include these 3 unexpected souls who had entered his life. Tomorrow they would leave Aspen Creek Farm, heading toward an uncertain future filled with both danger and possibility. Daniel didn't know exactly what awaited them in San Francisco or beyond, but for the first time in a very long time, he found himself looking forward rather than back, wondering what might be rather than mourning what had been. Outside his window, snow began to fall again, just a few scattered flakes, harbingers of the storm to come. But Daniel wasn't afraid. They had weathered one storm together already. They would weather whatever came next. With that thought, he closed his eyes and allowed sleep to claim him, dreaming not of loss but of journeys, of lilies carved in wood, of broken things made beautiful again. They left before dawn, slipping out of the cabin like shadows against the newly fallen snow. The world was still dark, illuminated only by the beam of Daniel's flashlight and the faint glow of stars not yet surrendered to morning. Their breath clouded in the frigid air as they made final adjustments to their packs, small bundles containing only essentials and the wooden treasures they'd created together. "Ready?" Daniel asked softly, his gaze moving from Eleanor to Charlotte, to Grace, who stood huddled between her sisters, Katherine's oversized coat making her seem even smaller than her 9 years. 3 nods answered him, determined despite the fear visible in their eyes. Daniel took one last look at the cabin, at the life he'd built with Katherine, at the solitary existence he'd maintained after her loss, at the unexpected sanctuary it had become for 4 souls thrown together by chance and storm. "Let's go," he said, turning away from the past and toward whatever future awaited them. The trek through deep snow was challenging from the first step. They followed the path of Daniel's snowshoes, which sank less deeply than regular boots would have done. Even so, progress was painfully slow. Grace struggled valiantly for the first mile, but soon began to flag, her small legs unable to maintain the pace they needed. Without a word, Daniel swung his pack to his front and knelt in the snow. "Climb on," he said, offering his back to Grace. "Are you sure?" Eleanor asked, concern evident in her voice. Daniel nodded. "We need to make better time." Grace wrapped her arms around his neck, her weight slight but precious against his back, as he rose and continued forward. The physical exertion was welcome, something concrete to focus on besides the enormity of what they were attempting, the danger that might be closing in behind them. The sky began to lighten as they pushed on, dawn spreading pale fingers across the eastern horizon. The temperature dropped further with the approaching daylight, the kind of bone-deep cold that made each breath a shock to the lungs. None of them complained. Though Daniel could see Charlotte's lips taking on a bluish tinge, Eleanor's jaw clenched against involuntary shivers. "Just over this rise," he encouraged, pointing to a ridge ahead. "Then we'll be able to see the highway junction." The words had barely left his mouth when Grace suddenly tensed against his back. "Listen," she whispered, her voice small with fear. They all froze, straining to hear over their own labored breathing. And then it came, the distant but unmistakable sound of engines. snowmobiles approaching from the direction of town. "Quickly," Daniel urged, increasing his pace despite the burning in his thighs. "Over the ridge and into the trees. We need cover." The sisters needed no further prompting. They pushed forward with renewed energy born of fear, fighting through snow that sometimes reached mid-thigh, heading for the crest of the ridge and the shelter of the pine forest beyond. They reached the tree line just as the sound of engines grew louder, cutting through the morning stillness with mechanical persistence. Daniel led them deeper into the forest, where the snow was shallower beneath the dense canopy of evergreens. "Down," he whispered, crouching behind a fallen log and gently setting Grace beside him. Eleanor and Charlotte joined them, faces tense as they peered through gaps in the underbrush toward the open hillside they'd just traversed. 3 snowmobiles came into view, following their tracks with single-minded purpose. Even from a distance, it was clear these weren't local search and rescue. The riders wore dark clothing, their movements efficient and coordinated as they scanned the landscape ahead. "Sophia's men," Eleanor breathed, her hand instinctively moving to the pendant hidden beneath her coat. Daniel nodded grimly. They must have convinced someone in town to guide them to Aspen Creek ahead of the plows, perhaps using the pretense of concern for the missing girls. "They'll follow our tracks straight to us," Charlotte whispered, fear evident in her voice. Daniel shook his head. "Not if we can reach the highway first. Jim's friend will be waiting with snowmobiles of our own." He checked his watch. "We've still got an hour, but they'll catch up before then," Eleanor said, her mind working rapidly. Unless we split up," Daniel finished her thought, already calculating distances and angles in his head. "The junction is about 2 miles that way." He pointed northwest, through the trees. "I'll lead them on a different path. Buy you time to reach Jim's friend." Eleanor's expression hardened. "No, we stay together." "Ellie," Charlotte interjected softly, "he's right. It's the only way." Grace's small hand found Daniel's, clutching it with surprising strength. "But what if the bad men catch you?" Daniel squeezed her hand reassuringly. "They won't. I grew up in these mountains. I know places they'd never find." He looked at Eleanor, whose internal struggle was visible in her eyes. "I'll meet you at the junction, I promise." For a long moment, Eleanor held his gaze, searching for certainty, for reassurance. Then, with obvious reluctance, she nodded. "Okay, but you have to promise to be careful." "I will," Daniel assured her. "Now go. Stay within the tree line as long as you can." Before they parted, Grace surprised him by throwing her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. "You have to come back," she whispered fiercely. "You're part of our family now." The simple declaration, so earnest, so certain, made Daniel's throat tighten unexpectedly. "I will," he promised again, gently disentangling her arms. "Now go with your sisters." As the girls disappeared among the trees, moving northwest toward the highway junction, Daniel took a deep breath and stepped back into the open, deliberately making himself visible on the ridge. The snowmobile riders spotted him immediately, changing course to intercept. Daniel turned and ran east, away from both the girls' path and Aspen Creek, leading the pursuers on a calculated diversion. His legs burned with the effort of pushing through deep snow, but adrenaline and determination kept him moving forward. The roar of engines grew louder behind him as the gap closed. Just as the lead snowmobile was about to overtake him, Daniel veered sharply into a dense thicket of pines, diving between trunks too closely spaced for the machines to follow. Shouts of frustration echoed behind him as the riders were forced to dismount and pursue on foot. Daniel pushed deeper into the woods, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay just ahead of his pursuers. He led them through a winding path that doubled back on itself, across a half-frozen stream where the ice creaked ominously beneath his weight, up a rocky outcropping where loose stones made footing treacherous. All the while, he kept the sun on his right, maintaining a mental map. of his position relative to the highway junction. Time was both enemy and ally now. Each minute he kept Sophia's men occupied was another minute the sisters could use to reach safety, but also another minute closer to the 8 a.m. deadline when their transportation would depart. After nearly 40 minutes of this deadly game, Daniel found what he'd been looking for. A narrow ravine cutting through the hillside, its steep walls slick with ice and its bottom obscured by deep snow. He'd explored it as a teenager, knew there was a cave-like opening about halfway down that was nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Without hesitation, he slid down the ravine wall, using pine branches to control his descent, and disappeared into the hidden cavity. Inside, he pressed himself against the cold stone, controlling his breathing as footsteps crunched in the snow above. Voices drifted down, foreign accents discussing which way he might have gone, whether to continue the pursuit or return to the snowmobiles. After what seemed an eternity, the footsteps receded, heading back the way they'd come. Daniel waited. 5 more minutes to be certain, then checked his watch. 7:40 a.m. He had 20 minutes to reach the junction, and the roundabout path he'd taken had left him nearly 3 miles away. It would be close. Meanwhile, the 3 sisters pushed northwest through the forest, Charlotte breaking trail, while Eleanor helped Grace navigate the difficult terrain. They moved as quickly as they dared, each step taking them closer to potential safety, but also farther from Daniel. "Do you think he's okay?" Grace asked repeatedly, her worried gaze constantly turning back the way they'd come. "He'll be fine," Eleanor assured her, with more confidence than she felt. "Daniel knows these mountains." Charlotte, who had been slightly ahead, suddenly paused. "I can see the highway," she called back softly, "and the junction." They approached the edge of the forest cautiously. Below them, the junction of 2 highways was visible, recently plowed, but still bordered by high walls of compacted snow. 3 snowmobiles waited in the cleared area, their engines idling. A man in a bright orange parka stood beside them, checking his watch with increasing frequency. "That must be Jim's friend," Eleanor said. "But I don't see Daniel." "We can't." "Wait here," Charlotte pointed out, glancing at the sky where dark clouds were gathering on the western horizon. "The storm's coming, and it's almost 8. Eleanor's face reflected her internal struggle, the need to reach safety warring with her reluctance to leave Daniel behind. Finally, she nodded. "We'll go down, but we won't leave without him." They made their way carefully down the slope to the highway junction. The man in the orange parka spotted them immediately, relief evident in his posture. "You must be Jim's friends," he said as they approached. "Where's Daniel?" "He led some men away from us," Eleanor explained, her voice tight with worry. "He said he'd meet us here." The man, who introduced himself as Pete, checked his watch. Again. "It's 7:55. We need to leave by 8 to beat the storm to the airfield." He gestured toward the darkening western sky. "Those clouds mean business." "We're not leaving without Daniel," Eleanor stated firmly, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone born to command. Pete looked like he wanted to argue, but instead shrugged. 5 more minutes, he conceded. "Then we have to make a decision." The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. Grace held tight to Charlotte's hand, her eyes never leaving the forest edge they'd emerged from. Eleanor paced the small cleared area, tension evident in every line of her body. At precisely 8 o'clock, Pete approached again. "I'm sorry," he began, "but we need to—" "There!" Grace shouted, pointing toward a different section of the tree line. "It's Daniel!" They all turned to see Daniel emerging from the forest, moving with the deliberate pace of someone pushing through exhaustion by sheer force of will. His coat was torn, his face scratched from branches, but his eyes were clear and determined as they found the sisters waiting for him. Cutting it close. "Morgan," Pete called, but there was admiration in his voice. Daniel managed a tired smile as he reached them. "Got a little sidetracked." Grace launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his waist in a fierce hug. "You came back," she said, her voice muffled against his coat. "I promised, didn't I?" Daniel replied softly, returning the embrace before looking up to meet Eleanor's gaze. The relief in her eyes was obvious, but there was something else there too, a growing trust, a deepening connection. "The men?" she asked simply. "Lost them in the ravine," he assured her, "but they'll figure it out eventually. We need to move." Pete needed no further prompting. He quickly outlined the snowmobile's operation and helped them mount Eleanor and Grace on one machine, Charlotte and Daniel on the others. Within minutes, they were speeding away from the junction, the snow-covered landscape blurring around them as they raced the approaching storm toward Grand Junction and the private airfield, where the next stage of their journey would begin. As they crested a rise, Daniel glanced back once at the mountains that had been his home for so long. Aspen Creek was invisible from this distance, but he could make out the general area, a dark smudge of forest against the white expanse of snow. The workshop was there, with Katherine's half-finished rocking chair waiting for his return. The cabin stood empty, but no longer abandoned. Even in their absence, it held the echoes of laughter, of shared meals, of stories exchanged by firelight. He would return someday, he knew, but for now, his path led elsewhere, alongside three extraordinary young women with royal blood and humble hearts, toward a future as yet unwritten. Daniel turned forward again, focusing on the journey ahead. The snowmobile beneath him hummed, with power, carrying him away from what had been and toward what might be. Behind them, their tracks were already beginning to fill with fresh snow, nature reclaiming the evidence of their passage. And overhead, through a brief break in the gathering clouds, a single shaft of sunlight illuminated their path forward, guiding them toward whatever adventures awaited beyond the horizon. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.